thank you all for being here and those at the live stream. In this lecture, I will present a learning methodology as experienced in the 10 studies by Vicente Paschoal. And although that shall be the main focus of this presentation, I will also go through a brief musical analysis. The essential movements for the execution of a certain technique must be unraveled in an attempt to help the audience, and whoever wishes to play this set have a better understanding of it. The musical analysis is justified because it will contribute to the desired musical outcome. It is also worth pointing out that the studies are not a mere collection of useful technique drills on the guitar. Neither should they be performed and studied with the exclusive goal to improve a technical aspect of the technique. As pointed out by the composer in one of the many conversations we had about this set, these studies are meant to be experienced in an artistic way instead of a purely didactic work. Now, when we talk about guitar technique, each hand will have their specific tools. So for example, the right hand, we're going to have arpeggios, for example, and well, for the left hand, slurs. Those are two very different techniques that are specific to each hand. I will be covering those and many others today. The first step in this methodology that I'm going to go through is to identify the technique or techniques that are at the core of each piece that we're going to see today, then understand the fundamental movements that will result in an effective performance of those, and then address it in the context of the piece itself. And this presentation will culminate in the world premiere of these 10 studies by Vicente Paschoal. Now, just a little explanation of how things are going to go. I will first talk about 5 studies, and then play 5, and then I'll go back to the lecture portion, talk about the last 5 studies, and perform the last 5. Okay? So now let's get right into it. Okay, so the first study can be divided into 2 big sessions, and I'll also show some examples of what I'm talking about. So this first study can be divided into 2 big sections, so therefore binary form, and we're going to call them Part A and Part B. The A section of this study will have this pattern for the right hand. So this is the first pattern in this study number 1. And what the composer is going to do is he's going to take that formula, right-hand formula, and play with chords. So we're going to go through different chords with that same combination of right-hand fingering. Now, the B part of this study is preceded by a little cadence. Well, we will hear a rising scale. And then we're going to move on to a new pattern for the right hand. So that would be when we get to the B section with a different right hand pattern. And after that, you're going to hear some very dramatic closing material with several changes to the arpeggio pattern, and then finally the final cadence of the piece. So the arpeggio is going to be the core technique that this study will address. It's going to work with endurance and speed. And there's a lot of bars, but I'm not going to go into that. So the technique itself, the arpeggio, should be addressed slowly at first, aiming for perfect legato and balance. Now, those 2 words are very important. To achieve that, the right hand should move the least possible, maintaining the same position of finger in relation to the strings. I also, it is important that the fingers move from the joint that is closer to the hand instead of relying on weaker joints. This will result in a more reliable technique. This piece also demonstrates one of the composer's favorite compositional devices, which is to use a chord shape and transpose it on the fingerboard. So for example, there's a passage in the B section where that is very noticeable. And he's going to move that down the fingerboard. This study will work with the arpeggio in a very interesting way, and the approach mentioned before, combined with an understanding of form that we just went through, will be helpful in developing an interpretation of this piece. Okay, now moving on to study number 2. Okay, so study number 2, this piece is going to be in through composed form. We use that term when the pieces utilizes a free unfolding flow of ideas without repeated sessions. However, there are different moments in this piece. They will be given by the pitches of the melody and a growing intensity. The first time the melody is heard, it begins in the open E string. Be the first presentation of the melody of the thematic material. And then the next arrival point begins when the melody is played an octave higher. Still that 3-note pattern. And then again, a few measures later, the composer is going to insist on that melodic idea, and therefore it gets even more intense. So this study by Vicente Paschoal has the slur as its core technique. However, the slur is not the most important event in terms of musical relevance. The composer combines it with a constant arpeggio that will offer its own layer of texture to the piece. So this is the opening material. With the addition of the melody, the result is melody and accompaniment texture. The character of the accompaniment is that it is always constant, while the melody behaves in a freer way. The constant motif of the bass line is called basso ostinato, or ground bass. And the main characteristic of this musical device is that it's repeated over and over again while the other components of music proceed normally. The challenge of this study for the players is to keep the melody in the foreground while maintaining the ostinato constant and in balance. Now the performing aspects of this study will be addressed in greater detail. So the slur in the guitar is when a note is plucked with the right hand and the following note or notes are played with a hammer-on or a pull-off. To have a clear sounding slur throughout, it is important to be aware of the movement that needs to be executed. The hammer-on or ascending slur should be executed with a fast movement of the left hand, creating momentum, while the pull-off will sound better when the left hand finger is pulled down, resting on the string below. The two fundamental techniques, ascending and descending slurs, should be isolated and then incorporated together. That way you'll be able to tell in what portion of the movement lies the biggest challenge for you, in the ascending or the descending portion of it. The intensity of those movements should be adjusted so that they don't obfuscate the melody in this piece. Okay? Now, moving on to study number 3. Okay, so again, a lot of these studies, they're going to be in through composed form. I think that's one of the characteristics of the composer. He likes how one idea connects to the other without necessarily repeating too much material. In that sense, talking about through composed, It shares a resemblance to a Baroque prelude, for example, and we're soon going to see why I'm mentioning that, where the music simply flows from one idea to the other, and that is very much how this study will sound. There are three very evident cadential moments in this piece that, combined with the harmonic movement of each section, will give the listener a sense of moving forward. So this piece will focus on an advanced guitar technique, which is the two-string trill. This technique consists of playing the first note, which is called the real note, on the lower string, followed by a pluck on a higher string on the next diatonic note of the scale, and then coming back to the first note. And as you can see, that's in the tenor part of the texture there in the beginning of this study. One of the most efficient ways to perform this is to finish the three-note motif with a thumb pluck, since that is the direction of the embellishment. So to finish that with a thumb pluck will naturally give the direction that is required for that technique. To practice this two-string trill in this piece, we can use a tool called preparation. That is to position fingers I and M on the two strings they will pluck before they are actually plucked. And while doing that, the thumb should stay as close as possible to the lower string, which is the one it's going to play later. So practicing this movement slowly with preparation, placing I and M on the two strings we're going to play, will make the trill be performed with clarity and the right direction. Okay, so this is a piece that will not work with contrasts. All the musical interest that should be highlighted by the performer will come out of harmony and texture. What that means is that the harmonic path shall guide the dynamic changes, and the texture changes will work as announcements of new arrival points. So this is going to be a two-string trill study, basically, and the technique is very clear here, what he's working with. That will not always be the case, as most pieces will work with multiple tools. Moving on to 4. Okay, just let me tune this down. All right, now the fourth study is one of the most expressive pieces of this set, one of my favorites. The indication of characters being molto, espressivo, legato, and maestoso gives a good idea of what the composer desires as an outcome for this piece. In many aspects, this piece is very simple. The rhythm is constant, and there aren't many challenges for the left hand, except for a few measures. The composer is working with voice leading and dynamics. Therefore, the required technique is a fine control and balance of the right hand fingers. As opposed to the previous study, here preparation is not desirable. The fingers should touch the strings only at the moment they need to be played. This shall result in a much more effective legato. So for example, the opening section of the piece. So working with balance so that the three notes ring reasonably in balance, and placing the right hand fingers on the string only in the moment that they are going to play. Now in the guitar, a legato is achieved by a combination of right and left hand. The right hand, like I said, should touch the string only the moment it's going to be played, while for the left hand, the sustain will only sound and occur as long as the finger is still on the string. If we remove, there's some resonance here, but if we remove the finger, there's no sound anymore except when it's an open string. So that is something to be aware about. Now, in terms of balance, which is another thing that requires our attention in this piece, it's important to be aware that the thumb will naturally generate more sound than the other fingers. If we just do it without considering that, usually the bass is going to come out. So when practicing, it is necessary to pay attention and hear that, and the intensity of each note, and adjust those accordingly, controlling the amount of pressure you apply to each string. Study number 5. So this study is not like the other ones. This one is going to work with some contrasting sections, and they can be divided into 4. Therefore, classified as a free sectional form. And this type of sectional buildup cannot be reduced to any one formula because it allows for any free arrangement of sections which together make a coherent whole. Any arrangement that makes musical sense is possible. That's a quote I took from Aaron Copland's book, What to Listen For in Music. I read it at some point in my master's, and I thought it was a very precise description and clarifying. Now, addressing the specific technique in this piece. Again, the slur can be presented with many variations, and in this study, it will be to address technique. However, the difference here is that the slur is going to be in the foreground of the musical events, which is not what happened in study number 2. And there's also the addition of the bar. The bar is when we play, we hold 2 notes with the same finger, 2 strings with the same finger, or more strings. 2 or more strings. Since the bar is a new technique addressed in this one, that's integrated in this study, it will be addressed now more than the slur. It's very tempting for us to use all of our grip strength here to just make sure all the notes sound clear, but that will not work in this study because there's just too many bars. So it's important to be aware that we don't need as much energy usually as we think to perform that. So we need to be aware of the amount of energy to use in each bar and recognize short passages where the left hand can relax. So for example, study in the first 4 measures of study number 5. There are brief but important moments between each chord that can be used as points of relaxation for the left hand. The shifts from the 7th position of the instrument to the 3rd here. So the shift here. From the 7th position to the 3rd, and then the 5th. Those are moments where the left hand will be able to relax between the shifts, so when we let go of the bar. This is a rule that must be followed throughout this piece. And there are 2 other aspects that I would like to address about performing the bar. One is to combine multiple muscles to help press the strings. So instead of relying on only the hand muscles that are weak and easily fatigued, we can activate our shoulder and back muscles to help apply pressure on the strings. And the second aspect is to use a little bit of the weight of the arm itself to help produce more pressure on the strings. That's gonna make the work for your left hand and this motion here a lot easier and lighter and much possible to do. That is especially, those 2 rules are especially useful in static positions of the left hand. And the use of those techniques in slow practice will increase the player's awareness and contribute to a better performance of this study. So now I will play from 1 to 5. Thank you. Okay, so now let's move on to the last 5 studies of the set. Just get this out of the way. Okay, just want to check that's 6 there. Okay. All right. Now, let's talk about a little bit about study number 6. This is a 2-voice piece that is influenced by many Brazilian rhythms and genres, I would say, like Baião and Bossa Nova, evident respectively by syncopation in rhythm and harmonic movements. Now, just we understand a little bit of, you hear a little bit of the harmony, but I would like to just explain a little real quick what Baião is. It's a Brazilian rhythm with many different variations, but this is the simplest, usually, form that is presented, which is this 8th note, a dotted 8th note, and then a 16th connected to the next beat. So. And although that rhythm is not literally in this piece, the syncopation is very present in study number 6. It is relevant to mention that from this study onwards, there are no fingering indications in the piece, so they're all mine, and they will be incorporated in the final editing of this set. Okay, now this piece will have 2 clear, 2 measure themes. Okay? So this is how it sounds. Okay. Those 2 measures are first in 3, so 1, 2, 3, and then 4. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4. So that theme is kind of what will unify the sections of the piece and help with our musical understanding of it. This study does not have a single technique that is more evident than others. I would say it will work with right and left hand synchronization and voice balance. An important aspect of performing this piece is the active metric awareness it requires. This will be very important so that the accents are placed in the correct spot. Now let's take a look at measures 13 to 18, for example, as one of that. From measure 13 to 18, so for example, we're going to have this, and measure, you see the first one is 13, on measure 14 we have this. And then we're shifting to a 4-4, 3-4 again. So there's kind of going to be this constant alternation. And that section, for example, there's a little bit of thematic material in there. And the reason for that syncopation, something that also helps with the perceived, with our perception here, is that the high notes are on the offbeats. So that is something to be aware about when learning this piece, to make conscious decisions to that effect about the metric changes. So concluding and moving on, this study, something that is very desirable is clear rhythms and metric awareness. Those are going to be important in the desired musical outcome of this piece. And this one represents really well what the composer's intentions are with this set, which is not just a compilation of useful guitar techniques that are displayed in a way to try and make it musical. Quite the opposite. It's like this piece makes use of multiple aspects of playing the guitar to make an interesting piece of art. And it's one of my favorite, as you'll hear later. Okay. Now, study number 7. So this piece is going to be in ternary form. In other words, it will have two contrasting sections that will be posed one after the other, and then a return of A, which we're going to call A prime, with a slight accompanimental change, and then an interruption of the previous material for a short closing section. The transition to the B part, which is very intense, is seamless. And you're going to hear that because the piece starts moving faster. So this piece is a left-hand study that will address movement in thirds and shifts. Those two combined will result in one of the most challenging pieces of the set. And one thing to be aware about that is very important is that the thirds should be very distinguished from the sound of the melody. So for example, in the A part of the piece, we're going to have this material. So the melody should really be highlighted in a way that the third, and performed in a way that the thirds don't cover up that sound. And this can be achieved by playing the melody with the A finger and the accompaniment with P and I. Naturally, you would look at that and think about playing the accompaniment with I and M, but I thought, and it makes biological sense, that P and I are much more independent from A than M would be, for example. So it's much easier to bring out a melody playing the accompaniment that way. The one thing to keep in mind while performing the thirds in the left hand and the number shifts in this piece is the pressure that is put on the strings. The more pressure used, the more difficult it is to shift because it takes more time for the left hand to relax. So even though it is technically the more challenging part, this should be the thirds should be very light. And another important aspect of the shift is that whenever a big one is required, for example, it's interesting to use an elbow movement to help move the hand. So for example, in this section, more interesting to, instead of trying to make the hand get there, to use a little bit of elbow movement to help bring the left hand up. Okay. So while doing that, all that the thematic material, the melody, should still stand out more from those many thirds. Okay. Now moving on to study number 8. This piece is also going to be in through composed form, and what gives the listener a sense of moving forward is how the harmonic material unfolds with tension and release. In the first two measures, the composer is giving us what to listen for. As it moves through time, it gets blended in a very complex texture, making it a lot harder to follow. Oh, sorry. Okay. So in certain points, the musical material that we recognize as melody will be on the tremolo and sometimes on the bass notes. The use of certain motifs are also good cues to be aware about. So for example, this section, there's a melody that's going to be present throughout the piece. And it's going to be present in different moments with different characteristics and intentions. So the tremolo, now addressing that, is a very characteristic right hand technique in the guitar. And there are two basic forms. And so one is where the high notes are more distinguished from one another. And the second one, so both are kind of in the extremes, where the tremolo is more of a blur. And the second one here is going to work better for this study. So it is achieved with the less distinction of between the high notes, this last more blurry tremolo. And to that outcome, the right hand should be angled in a way that flash is more present and the three notes are played very fast. For the first string later, the finger should move there and the right hand stays in the same position. Now moving on to 9. This one is one of my favorites from the set 2. This is a really interesting study. It seems like time stands still, which is very intentional. And it has a subtitle, como uma montanha parada uma música parada sobre uma montanha em movimento, which translates to like a still song on a moving mountain. That is a direct citation to the Brazilian popular music artist Chico Buarque. So, like I said, this piece is going to sound very cyclical, kind of insisting in the same idea, this two-note motif. So like in the opening section. Okay. We start getting a little more movement in the second half of the piece, where there's a pickup note that's kind of directing us and moving us forward in this section here. But that's the first moment we start getting a little more movement, at least one that's more evident. This study will work with voicing and finger balance one more time, but this time it is desirable that some notes stand out from others. At first, the soprano voice is in evidence. That's going to shift a few measures later. Where the interest now is in the tenor voice. And not long after that, there is a combination of both registers and therefore more complex texture. The way to bring out a note in the guitar more than others is achieved by a very specific technique where you press the string into the soundboard. So instead of moving in parallel motion like this, we're going to think of a movement going 90 degrees in the soundboard. And you can bring out different notes with if you wanted to, with that technique. So instead of So there are many situations where this is important, this technique, not only in this piece. And for that reason, the player should develop that skill in all four right-hand fingers. Okay, and now moving on to the last piece of the set, and then performing it. Here we have, again, very clear contrasting sections. We have first A, which is going to be an alternation of arpeggio and scale. And then when we get to the B section, just to make it clear for everyone, is the arpeggio is kind of going to take over the piece. And for the C section, we're going to have introduction of new material with some slurs. So again, combination of numerous techniques. But I'm not going to spoil that section to you. And finally, a beautiful slower section right before the return of A. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about scales and how to work on those in this context. Since they're short and fast scales, once the right hand and left hand fingers are settled, it is very useful to work with short passages, like from one note to the other, but very fast. So for example, the opening material, here we have this scale. So one useful strategy to do that is continuously add notes to that little speed burst that you're going to think about. So first 2 notes connected, then you add a third, and then until eventually you get all the notes of the scale. That's a very useful tool to work on passages like that and scales like that. Now, this study came to me with an open ending. It is the only one that Vicente said that he was not totally convinced with the last few bars, so the ending I will perform today is my contribution to this piece in terms of composition. I wanted something triumphant and energetic, and I believe that those outcomes are achieved with this ending. I should have put the examples there, but no. Okay. And before I perform the last studies, I would like to thank a few people finishing the lecture recital here. First of all, my fiancée, Carol, for traveling countless hours to stay here a week with me and be here today. And I have a list just so that I don't forget anyone. To my advisor, Dr. Robert Trent, who's there, who guided me in these 2 years and was essential to my development as a professional. To my friends as well, João, Beatrice, and Ben. To my parents, my fiance's parents, brother and sister, as well. And of course also the composer Vicente Paschoal for contacting me and to work with his pieces, and it has been a pleasure working with him as well. So yeah, now I'm just gonna play the last 5 studies. And of course, all of you, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.